Let me give you a piece of advice I've learned the hard way. The fastest way to lose your freedom is to treat the courtroom like it's just another room. People think respect is a performance, something you do when you feel like it. But respect is really discipline. And discipline is what keeps your life from sliding off the rails. This case stayed with me because the young man didn't come in scared. He came in certain that rules were for other people. I had to show him otherwise. When the file first landed on my desk, it wasn't the most serious charge I'd ever seen. It wasn't a homicide. It wasn't a major felony trial. It was a combination of issues that on paper looked like a young man who'd been skating on the edge, a disorderly conduct summons tied to an incident outside a nightclub, and a related courthouse conduct report from an earlier appearance refusing to comply with basic courtroom directions. But the notes in the file caught my attention. One line from the court officer: defendant refused to stand, smirked, stated, "I don't stand for anybody." Now, I've seen nervous defendants. I've seen angry defendants. I've seen people who don't know what to do with their hands because they're terrified. That's human. But defiance in a courtroom, calculated defiance, that's different. That's a test. The other thing that concerned me was the public noise around him. People in the hallway were whispering. A few in the gallery were craning their necks before court even started. My clerk told me quietly, "Judge, this one's got a reputation online. People are calling him a Cartel Heir." I don't sentence rumors. I don't judge hashtags. My responsibility is the person in front of me and the facts that can be proven. Here's what happened as I understood it from the reports, witness statements, and the video summary. It was late, after midnight, outside a crowded club. A line of people, music thumping through the walls, rides pulling up and peeling away. The defendant, a young man named Mateo Delgado, was with two friends. The bouncer told the responding officer that Mateo was asked to leave because he was yelling at staff and trying to push back into the club after being denied entry for being too intoxicated. According to two witnesses, the defendant didn't just argue, he performed. He wanted an audience. He paced. He pointed. He laughed. He kept saying, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And that's a sentence I've come to recognize. People who say that are usually standing on something other than character. The police report said the bouncer tried to de-escalate. "Sir, just step to the side. You're not allowed back in." Mateo answered, "I go where I want." Then came the shove. Now, it wasn't described as a vicious beating, but it was enough to knock the bouncer back into the metal stanchions, enough to spark panic in the line, enough that someone screamed and pulled out a phone. By the time officers arrived, the report said Mateo's friends were trying to pull him away, and Mateo was still yelling. Not fear, not regret, just indignation, like the world had insulted him by enforcing a boundary. When I read that, I felt a familiar heaviness, not because of the shove alone, though that matters, but because of what it represented, a young person practicing a lifestyle where consequences are for other people. And every time the world lets that slide, that belief gets stronger. What struck me most was a detail from the arresting officer. Mateo calmed down the moment the cuffs clicked, not because he suddenly understood, but because he realized the scene had shifted. New audience, new stage, different strategy. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between panic and calculation. This was calculation. As I continued reviewing the evidence, the pattern became clearer. There were statements from the club staff, a brief medical note for the bouncer, mostly soreness and bruising, and a summary of a short video clip recorded by a bystander. The clip itself wasn't played in my chambers, but the written description matched what multiple witnesses said, pushing, yelling, refusing to back away when asked. The most important piece of evidence, though, wasn't the shove. It was the defendant's behavior once he reached the courthouse. The court officer's report from a prior appearance described Mateo arriving late, walking past posted signage about removing hats and ignoring instructions. When the officer told him to step back, he answered, "Relax." When told to stand as the judge entered, he stayed seated. And I want to explain something plainly. Standing in court isn't about worshiping the judge. It's not about ego. It's about acknowledging the seriousness of the process, especially for the people who don't have power, money, or influence. In every courtroom, there's someone praying the system will finally protect them, a victim, a family member, a working person who took time off their job to show up. When a defendant refuses basic decorum, what they're really saying is, this process means nothing. And that's dangerous, because the process is all we have. By the time the case came onto my calendar, the public chatter had already taken on a life of its own. I don't go hunting for social media clips. I don't run my courtroom based on what's trending. But people bring it to you anyway. A clerk hears something from a nephew. A court officer hears it in the hallway. And in this case, it was everywhere. He refused to stand. He thinks he's untouchable. Cartel Heir. Let me tell you something about virality. It makes everyone louder, but it doesn't make them more accurate. In my courtroom, I'm not interested in what strangers claim about your family name. I'm interested in what you did, what the law says about it, and who you're willing to become next. Still, I was aware of the pressure it can create, not on me, but on the dignity of the court. When a courtroom becomes entertainment, people start picking sides before they know facts, and that's the opposite of justice. So I made a decision before the hearing even started. I was going to be calm, precise, and fair, and if he wanted to test the boundaries of respect, he was going to learn where those boundaries are, without theatrics, without anger, and without me losing my composure. The morning of the hearing, I walked into my courtroom the way I always do, focused, prepared, and mindful that someone's life might change in that room. The gallery was fuller than usual, not packed wall to wall, but fuller. A couple of young men in the back with their arms folded, a few people who looked like they came for the story more than the law. And up near the front, I saw the bouncer, Mr. Callahan, sitting quietly, shoulders a little tense, a faint discoloration still visible near his cheekbone. Then Mateo walked in. He was dressed well, clean shoes, crisp shirt, hair styled, nothing inappropriate. But his posture told the story before he ever opened his mouth. He moved like someone entering a place he believed belonged to him. My clerk called the case. Mateo stepped forward with his attorney, and as I entered and took my seat, everyone stood, except Mateo. He stayed planted, looking straight ahead, as if standing was beneath him. I paused. Not dramatically, just long enough that the silence did the talking. I said, "Good morning." A few people answered. Mateo didn't. I looked directly at him and said, "Mr. Delgado, do you understand where you are?" He stared at me. Then he shrugged slightly, almost casual. I said, "When the court is called to order, you stand. Not for me, for the law, for the seriousness of what you're facing. Do you understand that?" His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. Mateo didn't move. Mateo said, "I'm listening. That should be enough." I took a breath. Because this is the moment where a judge has a choice. Respond with ego or respond with purpose. And ego is useless. Purpose is justice. I said, "Mr. Delgado, in this courtroom, listening is not a substitute for respect. Stand up." He smiled. A small smile, like he thought we were negotiating. He said, "Nah." When he said that, I felt disappointment more than anger. Because I've seen what happens to young men who build their identity on defiance. It doesn't end with swagger. It ends with bars. I said, "Mr. Delgado, you're not here to perform. You're here to answer. If you refuse to follow lawful courtroom instructions, you may be held in contempt. Do you want to go down that road today?" His attorney finally spoke. "Your Honor, I apologize. Mr. Delgado he's nervous," and Mateo cut him off. "Don't apologize for me." I looked at Mateo and said, "The one person you should allow to speak right now is the person trying to help you." He rolled his eyes, and that's when I knew we needed to slow down and make sure every step was clear. Because this young man was headed toward a cliff and thought it was a sidewalk, I said, "Well, counsel, what is the status of the charge?" The attorney explained there were discussions, possible plea, possible diversion, depending on compliance and apology to the victim. I nodded. Then I turned slightly and looked at Mr. Callahan. I said, "Mr. Callahan, thank you for coming. I know it's not easy to take time out of your life to be here." He nodded politely. I said, "Do you wish to be heard?" He stood, respectful, and said quietly, "Your Honor, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I got shoved doing my job. I don't want this happening to the next guy." That sentence hit me. I don't want this happening to the next guy. That's what responsible citizens say. That's what keeps communities from unraveling. I looked back at Mateo. I said, "Mr. Delgado, you just heard a man you shoved say he's not here for revenge. He's here for accountability. Are you capable of giving that man an apology?" Mateo smirked and said, "He'll live." I felt my jaw tighten, not because he insulted my courtroom, but because he was shrinking another human being down to a statistic. I said, "Mr. Delgado, that's exactly the problem. You reduce harm to whether someone survives it. That's not the measure of right and wrong." Then something happened that surprised even me. My bailiff approached the bench quietly and handed me a printed page. I glanced at it. Then I glanced again, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't misreading. It was a screenshot of a social media post, time-stamped from just minutes earlier. The bailiff had received it from courthouse security, who had been alerted by someone in the hallway. I read it carefully. It showed Mateo posing in the courthouse corridor, a caption that said, "This judge is doing the most. So dramatic. They really think I care." I set the paper down slowly. I looked at Mateo for a long moment. He was still standing, or rather still not standing, still confident. I said, "Mr. Delgado, did you make a post in this courthouse moments ago describing these proceedings as dramatic and stating you don't care?" His face changed, just a flash. Then he tried to recover. He said, "People post stuff. It's nothing." I nodded once. I said, "No, it's not nothing. It tells me exactly where your mind is. It tells me you're not taking this seriously and that you think consequences are a joke." He said, "It's just social media." I leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to reach him. I said, "Let me tell you something about social media. It encourages you to perform instead of reflect. But court is not a performance. Court is real life, and real life keeps the receipts." His attorney looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. I said, "Mr. Delgado, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you one more chance to make a good decision today. You're going to stand. You're going to address this court respectfully, and you're going to apologize to Mr. Callahan." Mateo finally stood, slowly, like he was doing me a favor. He said, "Happy?" I didn't react to the sarcasm. I kept my voice even. I said, "I'm not interested in happy. I'm interested in whether you're capable of self-control." I turned to Mr. Callahan again. I said, "Mr. Callahan, you deserve to be treated with dignity. You were working, you were keeping order, and you were shoved. That's not acceptable." Then I looked back at Mateo. I said, "Go ahead, apologize." Mateo exhaled, annoyed, and said, "Sorry." It was flat, empty. A word tossed like a pebble. I said, "That apology is for you, not for him. Try again." He stared at me. The room was silent. You could feel the gravity pressing in. Finally, he said more quietly, "Mr. Callahan, I shouldn't have shoved you. I'm sorry." Mr. Callahan nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply accepted it like a man who has seen enough nonsense and just wants peace. And I remember thinking, this is the difference between maturity and pride. The victim had maturity. The defendant had pride. Now it was my responsibility to decide what the court would do with that moment. I sat back and considered everything. The underlying incident, the pattern of defiance, the social media post, and the apology that only came after the court demanded it. I want people to understand something. I'm not here to crush young people. I'm here to correct them before life does it in a harsher way. I looked at Mateo and I said, "Mr. Delgado, you are not being sentenced for being young. You're being sentenced for being reckless with other people's dignity." I paused. I said, "You refused to stand in court because you wanted to show power, but real power is self-control. Real power is knowing how to behave when you're angry, when you're embarrassed, when someone tells you no." Then I addressed the social media issue directly. I said, "You posted from this courthouse calling these proceedings dramatic. Let me tell you what's not dramatic. A working man getting shoved because he enforced the rules. What's not dramatic is a courtroom asking you to behave like an adult. What's not dramatic is the fact that your choices can put you in jail." I took another breath. I said, "This sentence is not about revenge. It's about accountability and education." Here's what I ordered, and I explained each part. I said, "First, you will complete 80 hours of community service, and I want it in a setting where you serve people who don't have what you have. Shelters, food pantries, community cleanup, because you need to learn that society isn't your stage. It's your responsibility." I said, "Second, you will attend an anger management or decision-making program approved by probation, because you don't get to handle conflict with your hands." I said, "Third, you will write a letter of apology to Mr. Callahan, not a one-word sorry, but a real letter that shows you understand what you did and why it was wrong." I said, "Fourth, you will remain on probationary supervision for a period set by the court, with the condition that you have no further incidents and you comply with all court orders. If you violate, the court will consider harsher sanctions. Do you understand me?" Mateo's face had changed. The confidence drained out, not because he suddenly respected me, but because he finally heard the language that matters to someone like him: consequences. I looked at him one last time and said, "You can build a life on arrogance, Mr. Delgado, but it will collapse. Or you can build a life on respect and it will last. Today, you choose which direction you're walking." After I delivered the sentence, the courtroom felt different. The air wasn't as tense. People weren't leaning forward for drama anymore. They were sitting back, absorbing what had happened. Mateo didn't say much. He nodded, stiff, and glanced at his attorney like he wanted reassurance. The attorney gave him a look that said, "You got a break, don't waste it." Mr. Callahan remained calm. That's what impressed me most. Victims like him don't come to court because they enjoy it. They come because they believe the system is worth trying. And every time the system responds with fairness and firmness, it keeps that belief alive. When court ended, Mr. Callahan approached the bench area briefly, respectful, measured. He didn't ask for more punishment. He just said, "Thank you, Judge." And I told him the truth. I said, "Thank you for showing up. The court can't do its job without people like you." Later, in chambers, my staff mentioned the post again, how quickly it had spread, how people were arguing online, some cheering, some mocking. And I told them what I always believe. I said, "The internet will forget this in a week, but if that young man learns something today, he carries it for the rest of his life." That's the part the comment section never sees, the quiet hope behind a firm decision. Let me leave you with this. Respect isn't something you do when you're in a good mood. Respect is what you do when you're challenged, when you're told no, when your pride gets poked. And social media, especially for young people, can turn bad behavior into a badge. You get attention for defiance. You get laughs for disrespect. But attention isn't character, and likes aren't immunity. In my courtroom, I don't care who you claim to be outside those doors. Inside, what matters is how you treat people, workers, strangers, everyone. Because the way you treat others is the clearest measure of who you are. If Mateo learns that now, this case becomes more than a headline. It becomes a turning point. And that's what I still hope for every day I take the bench.